Okay. Thank you for joining us, everyone, in the middle of your day, or for some of us at the end. um, we are here to talk about the Israeli Black Panthers Haggadah with some very distinguished guests. This event is sponsored by Jewish Currents and the New Israel Fund New Generations, and also co-sponsored by JFREJ, that's Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, based in New York, Kavod, Boston's Jews of Color, Indigenous, Sephardi, and Mizrahi Caucus, and Trua. This event is going to run about an hour and 15 minutes and is also going to be simulcast on the JC YouTube page where you can find closed captioning. And you'll also be able to find it there after the event if you want to share it or send it to someone. For right now, the chat is going to be closed, but you can use the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen. For me, it's on the right-hand side, hopefully for you as well. And you can use the Q&A to put questions in. There will be a Q&A portion at the end. And if you see one that you like, you can like it. That'll upvote it so we know that you really want that question to be asked. Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started since a lot of you are already here with us. We, as I said, are here to talk about the Israeli Black Panthers Haggadah. I'm Ariel Angel. I'm the editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents, and Jewish Currents Press is collaborating with the New Israel Fund to produce and publish this book. So this book is based on the original resurfaced text of the Israeli Black Panthers Haggadah, written in the early 70s by the newly formed group, which was advocating for justice on behalf of Mizrahi people in Israel. We'll hear a lot more about the Haggadah through the course of this event and how this project came about. And you'll hear also from people who worked on it or who are affected by it. The book itself, which is now available for pre-order, and hopefully someone will throw the link in the chat, will have both the original text and as well as footnotes, which include sort of historical information, anecdotal information, much of it from Reuben Abergel, who was one of the activists and original founders of the group, and also one of the authors of the Haggadah itself, as well as essays both from Reuben and from other, the next generation of Mizrahi activists, including Sapir, who's also with us as a panelist today. So just to start, I'm going to give you just a very, very quick background on the Israeli Black Panthers, who were founded in 1971 in the Musrara neighborhood in Jerusalem. They represented kind of a second generation of Mizrahim who came from Israel and North Africa, from North Africa and the Middle East, and had been utterly failed by the new state. They came into the country and stayed in transit camps. They were sort of dumped in transit camps in the periphery, and really marginalized socially and economically by the Ashkenazi power structure. Many moved to the Musrara neighborhood in Jerusalem, which was first a wealthy Arab neighborhood before 1948, and then became sort of a border neighborhood with Jordan after the war. And this community moved into the houses that were vacated, by fleeing Arabs. And the neighborhood itself was sort of left to its own devices. It was a dangerous neighborhood. It was sort of, there were still mines from the war there. And it was sort of neglected without really basic services, without education. After the 1967 war, when Israel took control of East Jerusalem, Musrara was looked on as a development opportunity for new Soviet immigrants, and the Mizrahi tenants who had been living there were now also in danger of displacement. So this was the context in which the Israeli Black Panthers was formed, and you'll hear, I'm sure, a lot more about this from the panelists, and also the context in which this Haggadah was written. I just want to say on a personal note, when I was growing up in a heavily Mizrahi community in Miami, Florida, I really never heard about the Israeli Black Panthers. There was enormous pride in Mizrahi heritage, but there was really only real whispers about the experience of the new Olim when they came to Israel. I'd say only in the last couple of years are we hearing about, for example, the ringworm affair, where Jewish Mizrahi children were radiated for ringworm and many of them became sick, or the kidnapping of Sephardi children from their parents to give to Ashkenazi parents. These things are starting to come up a little bit more. I know a lot in Israel, but even a little bit in the United States. But I feel like the activism that was fighting against these conditions is still mostly buried, which is why I hope today we have a chance to talk a little about why and what that process was. So I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. I'll just read a short bio and then we'll get right into questions. Sapir Sluskar Amran is a radical human rights lawyer, social and political activist, poverty campaigner, and community organizer. She's the founder of Ezrachion, the activism archive for social movements in Israel, and co-founder and CEO of Breaking Walls, a new grassroots intersectional feminist movement. Welcome, Sapir. Itamar Hariton is an anthropology PhD candidate at Cornell University. He's been a freelance translator and editor for the last 10 years, and he's been collaborating with Reuben Abergel on writing and other political projects since 2010. Itamar is the translator of the Haggadah. Libby Linkinski is the vice president for public engagement at the New Israel Fund. Prior to joining NIF, Libby lived and worked in the Israeli nonprofit field for almost a decade, working with human rights organizations, documentary filmmakers, media initiatives, and progressive campaigns. And last but not least, Netta Hamami Tabib is an activist, educator, and group facilitator of youth and adult groups dealing with issues of identity and social justice. She's currently Trua's Israel program manager, and she's a teacher of Torah and social justice at Bina. As a Mizrahi woman, Netta has been involved in a variety of Israeli social issues, including feminist movements, campaigns against police violence, and animal rights. So I'll start by prompting each of you to tell us a bit about what brought you to this project and how it connects to the work that you do. So maybe we'll go in reverse order of the bios. Netta, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So first of all, I'm so happy for everyone that made that happen and everyone who's listening, because that's, like, for me, that's a small part of the, like, the tikkun, the repair that we want to do in our reality. And that for me was why I joined Sapir on the archives, like historic archives for the social movements in Israel. I will say in general that I remember when I was in high school, the first time that I realized that history is not something of the past if we don't do it right, if we just learn it and we don't ask for justice. And then it became, like, so clear to me that we have to tell all the stories that, and for all the people who don't have voices. And thank God if we have them, then we have to use them right. So through the archives and through working on all these social issues, I think it's like my life's mission.
Thank you, Netta. Sapir?
Thank you. And I want to say that this is not something that, like, I'm thinking about, there's like more than 180 people watching us now and actually care about those issues enough to participate in this kind of event. And I think that we shouldn't take it for granted, because I want to say 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if I'm looking at the past, it was such an issue that, like, if you were talking about it, you were like persona non grata in some of these circles of trying to insist talking about Mizrahi struggle and the meaning of that in other frameworks. So I really think that we should appreciate that there is an interest in it. And I want to say, for me, joining this project is, I'm thinking about myself as a community organizer, and I'm thinking about building now this movement of breaking walls, which is like intersectional feminist movement, working on ground, fully funded by the public, and I'm thinking about, okay, this is something that we do as Mizrahi feminists leading this movement, which Neta includes in the movement also. And for me, reading a few years back, learning about this Haggadah, this is something that exists in the world, thinking about it and reading it, for me, it was one of the, I want to say, most important text about community organizing. If you're reading the Haggadah, you can see that why this story matters, like why those, like insisting, talking about the story matters. It's because this is a story of a struggle. And doing all the Haggadah, they're asking people, they're telling them, don't be stuck in your daily life. Don't be stuck in your despair. Like, try to kind of ask yourself more, ask yourself for equality, ask yourself for a better life, but at the same time, don't expect us as activists in the Black Panthers movement, don't expect us to do all the work. Like, you should join us, you should organize, you should be part of the movement. And for example, when they were, asking people to join the movement, one direct action that they did, that they stole buckets of milk from wealthier communities in Jerusalem and brought it to the Mizrahi communities that were struggling with poverty. And they left a note and they said, this milk came to you like that today, but it won't come like that tomorrow. If you want that bucket of milk tomorrow, that you deserve that bucket of milk tomorrow, they weren't very, aware of veganism back then. But if you want that bucket of milk tomorrow, you should organize and you should join the Black Panthers, be part of the movement. And this is how you can join. Like, it wasn't something that they thought about as only charity and not something that they are representative of a movement. They really wanted to engage and recruit people to be part of the struggle. So this is why, for me, as a community organizer, as someone that's trying to make a change on ground in Israel, this is something that we need to learn inside the movement right now and outside of it. I think it's an amazing thing to debate and think about. Thank you, Ariel.
Thanks, Apir. Libby, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ariel, and hi, everyone. And I'm so honored. I'm so moved to be on this panel with this group of speakers and with you, Ariel, and with such an amazing crew that joined us to take part in this conversation. This project has really been, like, personally for me, a labor of love and something I feel many things about. So I'm gonna start in the personal and have, I guess, a chance to talk from my more professional hat a little later on in the conversation. And just in terms of like what brings me to this project and to this work, the people on the call who know me, which is quite a few of you if I'm looking at the names, know that I live in dualities. I myself am, I'm a gam v'gamnik, as we say, both and in so many ways, nationally, geographically, in all sorts of ways. And one of those ways is also my age. So I'm often bridging generations, and very often in my life and in my work, people are asking me, I'm 42 years old, but I'm often around people much older than me who are asking me, what do the young people think? What do young people want? What do they want from us? What do they want to do? And so I've spent a lot of time with people a lot younger than me. In the last few years, though, my own personal gaze, as I try to deepen my understanding of power and privilege and sharpen my analysis and tools for organizing and activism, my own gaze has turned to my elders. And when Sapir started talking to me about the archives, and when I first met Reuven Avergil, I felt like a endless well of insight and perspective that I didn't have at all in my entire life growing up in a very deep Jewish education and summer camp and day school and an activist family and all of that. And so in many ways, like this project has been a big bridge in that sense for me, and why I've been so passionate about it. Another way, and this just piggybacks on what Sapir just said, is that as I'm looking at the systems of power and of control here in Israel, where I'm currently sitting in Jerusalem, but also around the world, and I think maybe it's through a deepening understanding of my own feminism and of the impact of patriarchy on every second of my life and all of our lives, I realize that the people that I want to learn from are people who looked out onto this system and never saw something that they could win at. So I grew up around people who looked, for example, at the Israeli parliament, at the Knesset, or even at the military, and thought, well, one day maybe I could be the prime minister. And maybe one day they could have, even though we were always left wing. I come from a kibbutznik family. And that's kind of like one path of thinking about organizing. But as things have gotten more polarized, more populist, and shifted in all sorts of ways, I actually find that for me, the sharpening of my own tools, the things that really challenge me to think differently about how we might organize, how we might engage, how we might change things actually here, those lessons come from people who never saw a system that they could win at, because that's where the lessons about toppling come from. And that's why for me, I could just sit for hours and listen to Reuven talk. And I have, and I will continue to for as long as I possibly can. And so that's what personally brings me into this project and into this work. I'll, I guess, speak more professionally about it a bit later. Thanks, Ariel. And thanks for having me on this panel with such a awe-inspiring group.
Thanks, Libby. Itamar?
Yes, I want to join everyone in thanking and being grateful for this opportunity to speak to everyone. I feel really blessed to be a part of this project and to be a part of this event, which I hope and I believe will be the beginning of a deeper and broader conversation of these issues in the American left and in the American Jewish community in general. How does the translation of the Haggadah relate to my work, and how did I come to this project? I have to start when I met Reuven in 2010 when I came to Israel back from, I grew up in Israel, grew up in the United States and then I came back after college, after I'd found out about the occupation in college, and I wanted to see what resistance there was to the occupation in Israel. So that's how I came in 2010 to political work. And I went to the Social Justice Fellowship, the New Israel Fund Social Justice Fellowship, and I met in a political convention, I met Reuven, and Reuven explained to me that he's doing a project of organizing Mizrahi Jewish and Palestinian street vendors in Jerusalem who are being evicted for different reasons and trying to unionize them. So I said, okay, so I'll do this as the project. And Reuven very gently and passionately and systematically and poetically explained to me that you can't understand the occupation if you don't understand racism within quote unquote Israeli Jewish society. He showed me Netta was talking about this before, that what people in Israel, even if they know the history of anti-Mizrahi oppression and racism, they think this is something of the 1950s, this is something of the past. There's a progressive narrative, which is also, in the United States, a lot of this progressive, things are only getting better with time. Like Netta said, Reuven constantly explained that history is not history. And he showed me, the Jewish street vendors that we were talking to would say, the police came and said, don't work with these Palestinians, don't work with them, we'll take care of you. If you keep the dirty laundry within the within the Jewish community, within the Jewish family. So he explained to me these issues for the first time, and we became very close friends. He's still one of my closest friends and collaborators. And what he explained to, I mean, we would walk around, you know, I did co-led tours for English speakers in the neighborhood with my friend Asaf Shalev, who's a journalist who also writes about these issues. And the main thing the main way that the Haggadah relates to this political work is that Reuven explained to me that that the Mizrahi struggle is unknown both in Israel and in the American context because of what he perceives as a very intentional kind of bracketing of the Mizrahi struggle through linguistic means. So isolating them from the rest of the world, also because of the historical circumstances of how Mizrahim got to Israel, isolating them from the rest of the world. And so he really wanted me to help him translate, like get to audiences outside of Israel to talk about the issues, to break the taboo of internal versus external. And so I said, you know, that translation is going to be my political work with Reuven. So we worked on many texts, and I could say more about what the experience was in the last 10 years, but you know, the Haggadah is part of that political collaboration of trying to get the Mizrahi story to be beyond the linguistic and kin boundaries of the Jewish community.
Thanks so much, Itamar. So Livia, I think I'll start with you. And I know that you're eager to tell us a little bit more about how this project came about, particularly, you know, where this text came from, how it resurfaced, and where we're at now with that, just to kick us off.
Sure, I'm happy to. Though I think of all of us, I'm looking around, I might be the newcomer into this text and into this project, but I can tell you where it started for me and how we came into this relationship with Jewish Currents, and that piece of it, which is basically that, as you know, part of the work that I'm responsible for at New Israel Fund and really like in general for the last, I don't know, almost 20 years of my life is around translating both sides to each other, not translating technically as Itamar has done with this text, but looking for the points of relevance that can create a bridge between American progressives and Israeli progressives and Palestinian progressives too sometimes. And I'm always kind of like balancing between things that I know people already care about from the American Jewish left and from, you know, the communities that I'm in touch with and working with in the US. I'm sort of like thinking all the time about the areas that I know they're already engaged in, that I know they already care about, that are in the headlines, that are being written about, that are, you know, in the zeitgeist. So I do a lot of storytelling and work around anti-occupation activism, sometimes around religion and state, things that are at the top of people's minds and in the headlines. But the other side of the work that I task myself with, and that's important for me to always be pushing towards, are the areas where that relevance exists, but the awareness of the thing isn't there yet. And so about, I guess it must be like 3 years, Sapir will correct me if I'm wrong, but a colleague of mine from NIF in Israel, who knows that I have been increasingly committed to bringing out stories and voices that really that haven't had a lot of prominence in the American Jewish or political communities around activism and change making here in Israel. So she had just, I think she got an email from Sapir or somebody else with a Hebrew revival of the Haggadah. And she was like, this is for you, do something with it. It was like 2 weeks before Pesach, 3 years ago. Can you do something with it right now? And I, for a second, thought, all right, let's do it. Let's hustle. Let's get this out now. But then once I actually looked at what was there and started talking to Sapir and others about what had already happened in this process, it was clear that it needed greater care, more time, more attention, actually, to figure out how to have this piece of text cross the ocean. And that was right around the time that I think that Jewish Currents was working on a first book in Jewish Currents Press, which is a amazing, beautiful book of poetry by my dear friend Haviv. And I was aware of that really fun thing that the younger for trying things so disappear. We started talking to Jewish Currents about making it into a book and figuring out how to make it cross the ocean. And then we learned that Itamar had already translated it. So a lot of the work had already been very meticulously and sensitively done, which meant that we could really just plow forward. And when I say plow forward, it's taken us 2 years. And part of that has to do with COVID crisis, and part of it has to do with really the amount of care and sensitivity that needed to go into this project. And people who know me know that I don't believe in coincidences. And so magically, because of the universe and because of the energies that swim around important things that need to happen, it turned out that we were ready with this on the 50th anniversary of the Haggadah. That I want us to before and
Libby, I think you are,
really
Libby, I think you're getting a little too broken up to understand, unfortunately.
A chance to already have an intuition. Oh, there.
I'm sorry, we might have to move on just for a minute because you were breaking up intermittently, but you broke up really bad at the end. I think we weren't able to understand. Itamar, just for a moment, or wait, maybe we're getting, Libby, do you want to try again?
If you can hear me now, but if not, then just feel free to move on and I'll try to figure out the internet.
I can hear you now if you want to wrap up. Oh.
Okay, oh no, not so much. Just go on without me. It's totally fine. People have a lot of interesting stuff to say. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry about that. Itamar, so I wanted to, since we talked about the translation, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the experience of translating this and also of working closely with Reuven. It's a shame that he can't join us. And I think that I know you've talked a little bit about the linguistic isolation, and so you can talk a little more about that, but I'd love to hear about the process of translating it, what some of the decisions were that kind of affected the direction of the translation, and what that process has been like, and sort of what has been your experience going through this process with Reuven.
Yeah, so thank you. So I'll explain just a little bit more about what I mean by linguistic isolation, just to set the scene as Reuven explained it to me, that the Mizrahi Aliyah, immigration to Israel, was at the same time a cutting off of most Mizrahi people from the communities and the worlds that they used to belong to, which was not exactly the case for Ashkenazi immigrants to Israel. So the isolation from the world, I mean, the entire Arab and Muslim world was declared an enemy states, and so there was all of a sudden linguistic and cultural marooning. Okay, and at the same time, Reuven explained to me, and you can read in the Haggadah about the marginalization and exclusion from educational resources in the neighborhoods, in the Mizrahi neighborhoods. And so Reuven talks very consciously about that his way of communicating is orally, is communicating. He doesn't write many texts, but he's very, very precise and systematic and poetic in the way that he uses language. And so my challenge in all of the text is to figure out how to turn our conversation into a text. And the way that it works is we have a conversation. I write a first draft of something that I think kind of approximates it. We read it together. So I read it to him, and he also looks at it. And then he throws 90% of it out. He says, no, this is not exactly, let's turn this around, let's flip this around. And he kind of, we fit it into the linear mode, because if you think about it, the oral communication processes are all interconnected and one story flows into another, but the text is more linear a lot of the times. And luckily, Reuven and all of the Black Panthers, I think, and this is also really reflected in the Haggadah, have a huge, very high Jewish literacy as compared to me. If you look at the Haggadah, it's filled with references to the Talmud, Torah, many, many, many things that I didn't understand that I needed help on. And here I want also to acknowledge my colleague, San Davidav, who is another translator who went over the translation, helped me look for references. But that literacy kind of gave Reuven and me a model for working on Haggadah, where we would read the Haggadah, and then he would say, what does this mean? And then we would make a whole footnote, and I would draft the footnote, and it would be kind of like in the Talmud, where you have, a piece of Talmud, and then this commentary, and this commentary, and this commentary, and he would use those turns of phrase to kind of turn the conversation into something concrete. So that was the process of how I translated the Haggadah. Do I have time to go into some of the challenges, or should we move on?
Sure. Why don't you share one of the main challenges that in the process?
So I already talked about the Jewish literacy, and which was a challenge for me, and the challenge of going over a text many times and seeing that sometimes a text would spark a memory or a conversation, and sometimes it wouldn't. So there are many things that came later that I had to figure out how to integrate before. So just to give you guys a sense, we have 70 footnotes in this Haggadah. The footnotes are much, much longer than the Haggadah itself, and they're filled with all kinds of stories and things. So that was a big challenge. I think another challenge in the Haggadah is to really be clear about how what the political concepts that Reuven and the Black Panthers used. What is the meaning of the political concepts? Like, for example, when they talk about the establishment, Hamim Sad, how do you translate Hamim Sad? Hamim Sad is not government. Hamim Sad is the Ashkenazi institutional power structure in Israel. It's not just government, it's also the Zionist Federation. It's also the Jewish National Fund. It's also, all kinds of professional organizations that would exclude Mizrahim. In some cases, it's like Ashkenazi neighborhoods that, if you cross the border into the Ashkenazi neighborhood, you could be in jail even if you were a young child. And he talks about being arrested as a 9-year-old child for being in the wrong neighborhood. So this is another thing that is really important to pay attention to with Reuven's languages. Is very, and all the Black Panthers have a political philosophy that is often not accessible unless you make that conversation explicit.
Thank you, Itamar. I actually have a question about the translation that actually opens up to Netta and Sapir, and I have some other questions for the two of you afterwards. But something that I noticed when I was reading the text again last night in preparation for this is that that really the words that were used in the text were our fathers, our sons. They really are not language. There's not a lot of feminized language in this text. And there were things in the Haggadah that really stayed as they were. So, it was intentional, for example, to keep the typos in, as Itamar has told me, to keep the typos in the text to show that these were hastily written texts in some way, that they were in a community under stress without a lot of education. A lot of the founders of the Black Panthers were people who had dropped out of school for different circumstances and under a lot of different pressures. But, there is this question about, do you change the language now to be more inclusive? Or what does it mean to change that language? Or what does it mean to expand Mizrahi activism in a way that actually feels, the original Israeli Black Panthers, at least in the canonical telling, was a group of young men. So I wanted to ask you two about that, both as feminist activists and feminist Mizrahi activists, how you relate to that element of it, and then we can move on to some other questions.
I want to say about that the decision to keep the Haggadah as it is a brilliant one, because we put everything on the table. We say there was back then. We evolved. Everyone is evolving. That's a process, and we're not into like giving you some fake idea of how feminist Black Panthers were or things that did not happen. But I also want to say, feminism back then, it existed. It existed. Also, Sapir can say more about that. Even with the Black Panthers, the women there, when you start exploring the Israeli Black Panthers, you realize that the women there in this movement were like, I don't know how to even describe them, brilliant women, super feminist women without saying, hey, I'm a feminist. That's a different world. And that's very important for us to acknowledge how things were and say, we should all evolve, and we are a part of that. When you meet Reuven Abargel these days, you meet one of the most radical people in Israel at his age, like with everything where he grew up, and that means something. So yeah.
Sapir, I wanted to ask you.
Can I respond to that question real quick, just to add? We got a question about the gender. I got a question about the gender in the translation, and from the translation process and I asked Reuven because I wanted to be really loyal to the text. And he said that for him, avot and banim refers to children and parents. And he talks also a lot about ההורים שלנו, our parents. It's not, in our conversations, he's not talking about only fathers. And I think that there's, in Jewish texts, a lot of times avot banim does refer to children and parents in general. So he was very, very, and not just open, but enthusiastic about translating it to children and parents in the English, but to leave, as Neta said, to leave avot v'banim in the Hebrew original, definitely not to change. And I also want to underscore when we had that conversation, just as an example of the conversational style of this work, he told me a story about women, Black Panthers, women Panterot, who lay in front of the mounted police to prevent them from advancing when they did an action to interrupt a Zionist Federation event where Golda Meir was going to speak, and there were women who were blocking the police entrance and risking their lives in front of the horses. So women were very involved in the Black Panther movement, and it was very important for him to mention Louise Cohen, for example, was one of the main women activists in the movement.
Thank you, Itamar. Sapir, I wanted to ask you, I know that you work basically in archiving leftist movements within Israel, and also in sort of reclaiming some of these histories that haven't really had any opportunity to be documented at all. I wanted to ask you sort of what is the importance particularly of this story in this moment, and why it's so important to reclaim, and also if you can kind of talk about a little bit like the mechanics of forgetting, like why is this story being pushed out of the narrative at this moment as well, and in the last decades?
I want to say why this story pushed out, and why do we see a comeback of it, and why I also think it's a blessed response, but also a risky one. So we refer to that also. So first of all, when we're talking about archiving, when we're thinking about archiving and talking about the history, So the basic thing is who has the privilege, who gets the opportunity to tell the history, to write history. The winners, right? The ones who had the power. So if we're talking about alternative archive, if we're talking about an archive of social struggles in Israel, we're referring to an archive that talks about the other narratives. It's kind of, the underdog archive. The one that can tell the stories from the ground, from behind the scenes, and also can tell about the successes. I think that if we're seeing the story of Black Panthers, let's say the stories how it was told till today, going through history books or all kinds of books that we've learned in school, they referred the Black Panther struggle as a struggle that was based on emotions of discrimination, based on based on a race, based on race, okay, and ethnicity. So based on emotions, okay, there wasn't a discrimination. They felt while they're living in their poor apartments and crumbling buildings, they felt is that they experienced discrimination. So this is how it was presented at history books. If we even have the chance to learn about it, I didn't have the chance to learn about it. And when I went to high school, and so the idea, my insisting of telling another story is also telling the alternative story of the successes, but also the struggles that they had inside those social movements. And I think that when I'm thinking why this is so important to me, right? Because this is like a bit geeky thing to do, be so like invest in archiving and history. And I think that for me, it's important to do it as an activist, because I want to say that I think that if we won't have the opportunity to tell the history and explore it in our own way, we only have the narratives of that is very right-wing, Zionist, Ashkenazi narrative. And it's also kind of telling a story that there were people that fought, the activists, that most of them that we know about, that most of them are Ashkenazim and most of them are men. And we have the people that needed the support, the people that was the underprivileged one, that were Mizrahi, Palestinians, and Ethiopian Jews, and so this is kind of the boundaries that we're setting up, and I don't want those boundaries, because I know that if we're exploring the story, we can see that it's much more complex. And another thing about feminism in the Black Panthers movement is that there were women, but we might didn't saw them as, or back then didn't saw them as feminists, because it wasn't the feminists that we used to as like American feminism, the liberal feminism. This is a Masoretic and kind of religious feminism. This is a radical feminism. It's a Mizrahi and Black and Arab feminism. So when the sister or the mom of that activist from Black Panthers came to protest to support him when he was in jail, when she, I don't know, prepared the shirts or prepared the signs, or was part of the organized movement, and she prepared the food for the meeting, but also participated in the meeting, she was a feminist inside the movement. She was part of it. And I think that it was the right decision not to change the words that he used, but also not try to, set up an example of what we used to think when we were talking now about activism. That we're like, very insisting on politically correct, as we should, but that wasn't the deal back then. They didn't word it like that. The men were very involved, and the women were involved also. But if we're trying to think about who were the women that were involved in the movement, we know 3 or 4 or 5 names, because we are not including those moms and sisters and part of women that were part of the communities themselves and part of those families. And I want to say something about the importance of archiving like that, that if you're thinking about, now I can show you a photo of that, like, let's imagine a photo in the main square in Jerusalem. The police and Black Panthers activists are fighting with each other. Okay, this is in the National Archive here in Israel, the official one, they will tag this photo as riots. Okay, of riots, they even won't call them activists. They will say they were, I don't know, riots in Jerusalem, okay, about whatever. In my archive, in the archive of social struggles, we identify this photo, we take this photo of police brutality, because it is what it was. So this is also a major difference. And one last thing, I want to say why I think that this is very trendy to talk about the Black Panthers now, 50 years afterwards in the States now, and also this is very trendy in Israel. In the last year or so, there were kinds of movies about it, and Reuven was invited to participate in a lot of events and TV shows and things like that. And this is kind of a feeling of you getting recognition. The problem with that, I think, is that this can refer as the discrimination was in the past, but it's not in the past. It's still existing, right? And now we're like celebrating this issuing of the Haggadah, but this is not really a celebration because there's still evacuations for public housing. There's still discrimination. There's still young kids that's on the direct, track to go to professional schools, even though they're bright and brilliant. They shouldn't go to that schools. So I think that this is another thing that we have to keep in mind, that this is very trendy now, because there's I think there's intent of keeping it as something that was in the past, and to say that was belonged to another time, to another era, to another regime, also to another political party that was that controlled the politics in Israel and made all the decisions. But this is not existing now. And when we're talking about discrimination that's happening right now, when we're talking about solidarity between movements, when we're talking about those political issues, I think there's a lot of people that will come and say, you know what, this is bullshit. Or you're just whining about things that happened to your grandparents, but this is all in the past. But as history inflects the way that we see things now, the way that we need to deal with the reality now, I think this is also that we need to take into consideration and be very, I think, very sensitive about how we present these projects and other projects and how we discuss about Mizrahi issues, so people won't think, okay, we're celebrating something that was in the past, as there was the Black Panthers in the States, and there's still discrimination now towards Black folks. We still have discrimination now, not only against the Mizrahi community, but also against other disadvantaged communities inside of Israel. And for them, nothing has changed, right? There were things that changed, of course. But when we're talking about Manishtana, there's a lot of things when you're reading the Haggadah, you can see that actually nothing really has changed. It's just maybe we don't have enough legitimation to talk about it now and get support.
Yeah, Sapir, that's a great transition, because I was going to ask Netta, I mean, it's clear. So obviously the formation of the group itself was sort of a bridge, in the sense that they were very inspired by the Black Panthers and the kind of Black Power movement in the United States and the kind of broader anti-imperialist sentiments of the time. And I'm curious about how we think, and there's a lot of comments in the chat, so we'll get into it in the Q&A, but curious about how we think about this text, but also this movement as a sort of lens on how we think about kind of a more solidarious approach. You know, how we think, I know that you're involved, for example, in a lot of different movements, also in anti-occupation organizing, also in feminist organizing, also in animal rights organizing. How do we think about the approach that's on display in the Haggadah as a way to think about how we approach sort of the interconnectedness of these movements more broadly? And also, you know, you can take that as broadly as you want, because we're also talking beyond Israel and you know, in the world at large.
Yeah. You know, we have this saying in the Haggadah that every generation should tell the story of the Israelites going out of Egypt. And as an educator, I work mostly with youth, and I like to tell them, I learned from them to keep asking why, how come? It's kind of like a children are bugging you, but why? And that brings us to important places and understandings. Why should we tell this story? Why? Okay, we all got so used to it. But if we stop and ask why, then, and it's, of course, it's in the Black Panthers Haggadah as well, that we should tell the story of the Black Panthers. And my answer for this why is that because, first of all, as we said before, it's far from being over. Some events were in the past, but the racism and the injustice it's still here. And as we move generations, this thing with the generations, generations forget. And as we move generations, things are changing, and we keep hearing in Israel, but hey, we have Moroccan rich people, rich Moroccan, and we have this high-ranked person in the army, in the military, and we have this and that as a proof that something changed. And if we do what the Amram organization, I keep having them in my mind, the organization that is collecting the testimonies from the families of the Yemenite and Balkan and Mizrahi kidnapped kids. Another thing that people are unaware of. And they say, their slogan is, I don't know how to officially say it in English, but like something like acknowledgement, justice, and then healing. And we are aiming to the healing. We want to heal. We don't want to stay in this oh my God, we're so poor. Oh my God, we facing police brutality and the government brutality and ta. We want to heal, but we have to ask why these things are like keep happening and happened in the past, not only to the generation like the Black Panthers, as you said at the beginning, they were a second generation mostly for Moroccan or North African families, but if we explore that, we see that the same things happened with the second generation of Ethiopian Jews. We see that the same things keep happening like in other communities. And that's not like coincidence, okay? We keep saying that's something that someone is aiming for. And this policy that, I mean, I didn't grow up with this thought of, oh my God, there's a racism and someone is like wants to keep it that way to keep control of people, because that was completely crazy to me. And my family didn't speak about racism with me because they wanted me to grow up as a strong woman. Just keep telling me, if you'll be nice and polite and you'll be a hard worker, you'll manage in life. But that's a surviving mode that is so familiar. It's a lot of communities, specific communities, are familiar with. And when we ask ourselves why do we see the same methods about, for example, police brutality, the same methods that they are using on Palestinians through the last year, for example, coming into the protest of the last year in Israel, or in past years, 2015, 2019, with the Ethiopian Jews protests against police brutality. When you see that it's all connected, it's like these pills from Matrix. You take the right pill and it's hard. It's hard, it's no fun, but we have to acknowledge all of these things so we can do justice and we can heal. And when you see that it's all connected, we keep saying it's all connected, it's all connected. There's a reason why so many activists in Israel are activists in so many movements and not just one. Even just, I will just tell you about this new movement of One Climate, of activists that say, hey, the climate crisis is not just we all in one big boat. No, like some communities will suffer more. Some communities are already suffering more. And once we acknowledge that, we can do something to repair this situation. I think what Sapir told us about history books, that if we're lucky, we have one sentence about these issues, and they are being told from the eyes of, I don't know, the victors. I don't know if they're can be called victors, but there's a reason for it. And we have so many stories around us, and just collecting them and saying, hey, there's a narrative here that wasn't told, and there's a price for telling a single-sided story. There's a huge price for all of us. It's something that we need to shout, as the Black Panthers shouted.
Thank you, Netta. I want to move to some questions from the chat. I mean, I think that part of the reason, obviously, that that some of this history has been suppressed is there was an inherent and internal critique of Zionism within the original Black Panther movement. And so I wanted to, there's a lot of questions in the chat that are basically asking to what extent the new Mizrahi movements in Israel are adopting this broader critique, to what extent that's like actually a part of the picture now, and you know, the role that solidarity with Palestinian people plays in these movements currently, and what obstacles there are in that sense.
I can jump in. I think that if you're thinking about the Mizrahi struggle right now and solidarity between struggles, so first of all, I saw that one of the questions in the Q&A was talking about the solidarity between struggles that were back then in the 70s. And I know from moving stories and learning from the archives of that time and from other stories and narratives of people that were involved back then, is that the solidarity between people, between the Mizrahim that were part of the Black Panthers and the Palestinians, wasn't something that was very, I want to say, superficial, like in a way that they went to seminars so people can, you know, talk with them about why it is important to combine struggles. And so that came from something that was in a very like daily life. They lived very close to each other, and they had, some of them have the same experiences, and they worked together, they got arrested together on the streets, you know, from like minor felonies. And so when they organized the one of the first protests of one of the first demonstrations of the Black Panthers in Jerusalem in 71, it was very natural for some of the Palestinians to join them. Not as we see today, we need to change a bit of perspective. Not as we see today, you know, Palestinian joining the Mizrahi struggle. They came to support their neighbors, their friends, when they were talking about that they don't have jobs and they don't have a future and they don't have, money to buy groceries, and they can't go to school because they need to have their families. So it was a very natural bond in that way. And I think also when we're thinking about solidarity now between struggles, as I see it, I think that, again, those superficial attempts to kind of try to bond by force communities to say, you're all struggling against the same system, you should all unite together. It's not that simple. It's not that simple also because the government here in the last 50 years, and I think in the future also, is working really hard not to allow those connections to actually work. And how do they do it? If the Mizrahi is struggling, with people from public housing coming and trying to unite with Palestinians, talking about house demolitions, so they will give solutions for the Mizrahim to shush them, right? To lower the struggle, so people will feel, okay, like, we're Jews, there's someone that can take care of us, right? And it's not happening all the time, but just a second, there's an airplane, probably from the States. So this is something that doesn't happening all the time, but of course we can see it. And for us, I think when I'm doing work with Palestinians, I'm doing it and we're working together. We're trying to promote this solidarity, not because, of course, because I see it like as a broader agenda, but in fact, I see it that it's something that is super basic. And the struggling that we're doing together, I want to say, I know people not because we went to seminars together, not because we were, someone flew out to the States to do a conversation, I don't know, with Jewish communities about the conflict. No, I know them because we went to demonstrations together, we got arrested together, and we went to the parliament, to the Israeli parliament, to the Knesset together, and talked about the same things. And then we said, okay, we should connect. Look, this is a very natural thing. And I think that this is also a lot of the time we're talking about what can be the game changer in talking about occupation and trying to change some things here with the relationship in Israel-Palestine. And I think it will be naive to say the Mizrahi struggle, the Mizrahi concept and issues can be the key, the work that we're doing. But I do think that this is important to understand that if now we are working, I want to say, for example, right now we are working with single moms, okay? Some of them Mizrahi, I want to say most of them are Mizrahi single moms, living in poverty, trying to make a living. And those women, in fact, this is it's not a thing for them. It doesn't matter who they vote. It's not a thing for them to bond with the Palestinian women because they see themselves as fighting for the same cause, right? All they care about is to take care for their children and to have a safe place to live in. And so, but who can give them the opportunity to actually be an activist, right? Because to be an activist can be a privilege, can be a bonus sometimes that you can't afford because you have your daily hard life and you need to make a living. And that's it. You don't have the time to support other struggles. You don't even have the time and the power to support yourself. So those women, when I'm thinking about them, my purpose is to give them the opportunity to be community leaders, to bond with those women in Palestinian villages and with these women in Bedouin villages in south of Israel. I want them to get to know each other, and I want them to be friends, and I want them to work together. And I know that they can do it in a very, I think, in a beautiful way, in a meaningful way, but they won't have the opportunity to do it now because they're fighting for their children, for their home, they're fighting in poverty. And one more thing, for example, we were talking about, Itamar mentioned Luis Cohen before. Luis Cohen was one of the feminist women in the Black Panthers. And when Louise Cohen, she came from Iraq. She was in the Ma'abara, in the transit camps. And back then she was sending letters to David Ben-Gurion that was the prime minister back then, and to the establishment Zionist movement about the conditions. And she was later back then part of the Black Panthers movement, and she was a bit forgotten. And for us, it was very important to amplify something that she said all the time, and also the Black Panthers said in the Haggadah. In the Haggadah, they said this is like they're saying Metzuvel and Lesaper, but I think that as I read it, I thought about this is a mitzvah to tell about the struggle, not only in Israel, but also in the States and in all over the world. And what Louise Cohen did is she volunteered to tutor Mizrahi kids from neighborhoods so they will know English and mathematics. And why English? Because she said you have to tell your story in your own words. Don't let anyone else tell the story. So right now we are organizing to promote this project of English and storytelling for women activists, not only Mizrahi, of course, but women that are activists that also living in poverty, giving them the tools to tell their story. I don't need to tell about them just because I managed to learn English. I want them to tell the story. And I think that one of the things of trying to connect people is also give them the opportunity to do it, opportunity to support them on ground so they can, lift their head above water, but also give them the tools to be involved, to be part of this solidarity of movements, to understand what's going on in the world. Like this is at least the thing we can do about it, to support them, I think, and really trying to make a change that, again, it's not superficial, it's to work hard on ground and maybe not see the result tomorrow, see them in 5 or 10 years from now.
Thank you, Sapir. We have only a few more minutes. I wanted to ask one more question, which was basically, we are dealing with an experience of racism that the Jewish community obviously doesn't want to talk about. And it's no surprise, we have Rebecca Pierce joining us in the chat, also someone who was an early publisher of the Black Panthers Haggadah on the Unruly blog, which is the Jews of Color Sephardi Mizrahi caucus blog from JVP. It's no surprise that non-white communities in the Jewish community have been the ones who have been on the forefront of bringing this experience of racism into the Jewish community, and also the question of it's something people don't want to look at, even with all of the trendiness. And as Sapir said, it's like a trendiness that is almost like engaged with the idea of leaving it in the past, that it's already over. So we have some questions in the chat that have to do with accountability. Like, what does this project have to do with accountability, and how do we make sure that we're actually pushing this conversation forward, like in a way where we can get to the sort of deep structural change that Sapir is talking about? What does that look like both today in Israel and in American Jewish communities?
I think it depends on how we think about accountability. When I think about accountability, as I kind of mentioned before, I see my responsibility as resisting some of the ways in which the Mizrahi story has been distorted, according to what Reuven taught me. And one of the big distortions, which you already alluded to, is that the Zionist establishment, Ashkenazi establishment, I want to call it, presented Mizrahi Jews and many other groups that it brought to Israel as people who are in need of saving. And so they're being saved and Ashkenazi people are rescuing them. And this is a central discourse of exclusion, because if you need to rescue someone, then that person doesn't have something. It's like an empty, Reuven used the term, an empty cart. And so, and this is also, Reuven and I wrote an article about how the relationship between Mizrahi activists, Black Panthers, and the Ashkenazi left was that the Ashkenazi left saw them as not possessing an ideology, not having, maybe having feelings, as Sapil said, maybe having emotions, maybe having passion, but not having ideas, thoughts, analyses, things that they want for their future, things that they remember about their past, knowledge in the broad sense. And I see my accountability, very much accountability that Reuven taught me, to go against that and to show the very sophisticated and political and knowledge work that Black Panthers did. What Sapir is saying, the connections to Palestinians, for example, were very natural, but they're also very, very brave and very not self-evident. Like the Black Panthers were among the first to meet with the Palestinian leadership in France when it was illegal, according to Israeli law, to meet with Palestinian leaders. And their connection to the Palestinians and to the Black Panthers in the United States, they were called anti-Semites immediately by the Israeli government. Golda Meir, the prime minister at the time, she said, "Why are you connecting with the Black Panthers in the United States? They're anti-Semites." And the Black Panthers had such a courage and such a deep analysis of their situation that they knew immediately, just from seeing the pictures, even before they connected with Black Panthers in the United States, that this is racial exclusion that we're experiencing, a similar one, not erasing the differences that there are, and there are differences. And so they insisted, okay, if you call us anti-Semites, okay. That Reuven says in the introductory article, he wrote an introductory article for the Haggadah, where he says, you know, Israel taught us that anybody who sticks up for their rights in Israel is sooner or later going to be called an anti-Semite, because Israel takes as its, you know, the representative of the Jews in all time. So that's how I see my accountability. And I also see my accountability, I mean, this is another challenge. You know, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. And for me to hear, you know, I had to unlearn and deal with a lot of shocking things that I heard that I had no idea before. The fact that, you know, Reuven talks about he being called Schwarze Chaye in Yiddish. And Yiddish for me is like a home language. It's like a, you know, but, you know, that the front of the bus would speak Yiddish and the back of the bus would speak Moroccan. And that police officers that would beat him, some of them had numbers on their hands. These are things that are difficult, that are extremely complex. But I think that my responsibility as an Ashkenazi Jew and Israeli is to bring myself and bring my family history and listen and internalize these stories, and not shut off or bracket them.
Can you hear me now, or am I still choppy? I'll just jump in as a closing. I think this is probably our closing, and say that to jump off of where Itamar left off, that like where I'm coming from and what New Israel Fund and New Gen and what we're out here doing is really focused on ending racism in Israel, making Israel a place of full equality, ending the occupation, equal rights for all, etc. And so that's, for me, like the first source of accountability, of tikkun, of reckoning, is that Israeli on the ground in Israel piece. And I also want to really, really encourage all of us who are based in the United States, who are in the American Jewish community, to see them also as a source for understanding what it has meant for so many decades for Jews coming to a place where Jews are the majority and still being left out of the story and experiencing real, true racism and discrimination, something that American Jews and Jews of color in particular are raising up, are talking about in our communities in the United States. For me, this story is so important in also in dealing here on the ground, but also in dealing there on the ground. And these are not new issues. And so for me, I think the thing that I want to leave everyone with is just an encouragement to dig into this story, because I think it can really help us all.
Thanks, Libby. Netta, do you want to impart any closing words before we?
No, I think there's a lot more to say, and
Yeah.
that's a good thing. Just that we're fighting against a lot of things for many, many years, but there are the good people and the smart people and the kind people to do that. So just as Libby said, don't be afraid to explore, even if it's painful, because we're like on our way to healing.
Thank you so much, Netta.
I just wanted to say, just want to share shortly that I think that there's a lot of questions in the Q&A section. I think that there's a lot of people that want to learn more, and I think that it's also amplify that you guys don't know enough about struggles in Israel that related to Mizrahim in the past and right now. And I think that this is a very common thing to be focused on the relationship between Mizrahim and Palestinians. But we also need to learn just about Mizrahi struggles happening right now, and about other communities struggling right now in Israel. And of course, this is all related to the Palestinian struggle, right? Net explained it very well before me. So I don't need to clarify it again, but I do think that someone asked in the comments, why do we need to do about, and I think that what I see that happening in the last 3 years, that there's a lot of people that interested about those issues. So they inviting one of us or a bunch of serious to talk, 50 to 20 minutes about the Mizrahi struggle. But we need more. I don't want to sit in one chair of talking about the Mizrahi struggles when there's a bunch of 20 people talking about all those other issues. So I think that what I'm asking, if I want to be a bit more, have the Israeli chutzpah, if I'm allowed, is to say, please invite us. And when you're coming to Israel, and call us and get in touch with us so we can, help you with introduce some more activists working on ground, some people that dealing with gentrifications and house demolitions and public housing, and working very hard against the government in building bridges and solidarity between strugglers. And when you're thinking also about panels and all kinds of delegations, we have this program now of really giving some other women the chance to learn English. So we would really appreciate that you connect with us and invite them also to talk. I want to say that if we're talking for a second about Mizrahi feminism, one of the major scholars was Vicky Shiran, that died 20 years ago. And she said that you should never accept an invitation to sit on the Mizrahi chair when all the other chairs is talking about feminism or whatever, and you're just sitting to talk about the Mizrahi struggle, like it's disconnected from other struggles, about the feminist struggle, a Mizrahi feminist struggle. Like you have to insist on not being the only one in the panel, not being the only representative. Even though that is personal for us, it's nice to go to all these events. I do think we should engage some more people, and we should have some more events like that. So we will be very appreciate Itamar and Neta, and I know that Libby also, to think about some more events, more conversations in Zoom, and here in Israel, Palestine, or in the States, or whatever. But this is very important for us to introduce those struggles and think about it from a broader and global perspective, and also connect with you guys and hear about the struggles that you're part of. So thank you, Ariel, for organizing, and Jewish Coins and NIF and everyone for participating. And I really hope that this is not a critique, but more something that I really wanted to say from my heart to all the people that I can't see right now, so they can understand a bit more what we're facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sapir. Thank you to all of our panelists, Libby, Itamar, Netta. As I said, you can access this on our YouTube page, and there should be a link. And also, I hope that you will pre-order the Haggadah, and again, to reach out to any of our panelists to get more involved in the work that they do. And I believe that their information will be in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your afternoon, evening. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.